The autumn of 1873 arrived in the Wyoming Territory like a debt collector, early, cold, and completely without mercy. Mavis Colton had $4.32 in a tin buried beneath the floorboard of the root cellar. She had a 7-year-old son named Percy, who still cried at night for his father, a 12-year-old daughter named Willa, who had stopped crying entirely, and that worried Mavis far more. She had a mule named Doris, who was going lame in her left foreleg, a leaking roof, and a promissory note from the Territorial Savings Bank of Cheyenne that was due in 31 days. What she did not have was any reasonable expectation of surviving the winter. Her husband, Daniel, had been dead 4 months. A snap decision, a poorly braced mine shaft, and 40 pounds of collapsed pine timber had settled the matter in July. The foreman at the Black Rock mine had handed Mavis a canvas pouch containing Daniel's last week of wages, $11.50, and had the decency to look at his boots when he told her the company bore no liability for accidents of that nature. She had thanked him quietly, walked home 3 miles in the dust of the high plains, and sat down at the kitchen table for a very long time without moving. She did not permit herself to fall apart. Percy and Willa were watching. By September she had sold Daniel's horse, his good rifle, and his pocket watch, the one engraved with their wedding date on the back. She had taken in mending from the women in Colton Ridge, the nearest settlement, 4 miles east. She had stretched every meal until it was more water than substance. She had written twice to her brother in Ohio and received no answer. The money in the tin shrank in the way all money shrank when a woman was alone, and the world had not been designed with her in mind. On the morning of the 15th of October, Mavis rose before dawn and stood at the small window above the kitchen basin, looking out at the gray pre-light settling over the high grass. The mountains to the west were already showing white at their peaks. The Laramie Range did not negotiate. What it showed in October, it delivered in November, and what it delivered in November would kill a family without adequate firewood food stores and a sound roof. She had one of those 3 things. She pulled on her coat, picked up the splitting axe from beside the door, and went out to work. She was mid-swing on a knotted pine log when she heard it. At first she took it for an animal, a low, irregular sound carried on the cold morning wind from the direction of the dry creek bed that ran along the western edge of her property. A wounded deer, perhaps. She set the axe head on the chopping block and listened. The sound came again, not an animal. A man's voice, hoarse and barely there, and beneath it the unmistakable wet rasp of labored breathing. Mavis stood perfectly still for 3 full seconds. The frontier had taught her what those sounds could mean, and none of the meanings were safe. Daniel had warned her more than once about drifters and desperate men, and the particular danger of a woman alone on an isolated claim. She looked back at the cabin. The windows were dark. Percy and Willa were still asleep. She picked up the axe and walked toward the creek. He was lying half in and half out of the shallow creek bank, face turned sideways in the frozen mud. One arm stretched out ahead of him as if he had been crawling and simply stopped. He was a broad-shouldered man in a heavy canvas duster that had been dark brown once, and was now so thoroughly soaked with blood that the color had become academic. A U.S. Marshal's badge was pinned to his chest, the silver catching the thin early light. Beneath the badge, 2 bullet holes had torn through the canvas and the wool beneath it, and the blood around them was partly frozen and partly still seeping. He was alive. She could hear it, that strained, bubbling pull of breath that meant the lungs were working, but only just. Mavis crouched down. She turned his face further out of the mud and pressed 2 fingers against his throat. His pulse was there, unsteady, too fast, but there. His eyes opened. They were gray, the color of creek water in winter, and they were trying very hard to focus on her. His lips moved. "Don't!" he managed, and then stopped, as if the word had cost him something he couldn't afford. "Don't what?" Mavis said, not unkindly. He didn't answer. His eyes closed again. She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the blood in the mud and the drag marks that came from the north, from the direction of the old Black Rock Service Road. Someone had shot this man on the road, and he had crawled, or been thrown, into the dark and had crawled again and ended up here. She looked at the badge again. She thought about the $4.32 in her tin. Then she thought about Daniel, who had told Willa, in the particular and earnest way he had of saying things he believed, that a person's character was not what they did when it was convenient, but what they did when it cost them something. "Lord, have mercy on my judgment," Mavis said quietly, and reached for his arms. He was not a small man. She was not a large woman. Getting him from the creek bank to the cabin took 45 minutes, a rope looped under his arms and thrown over Mavis's shoulder, and a level of profane internal commentary that she was grateful her children could not hear. She slipped twice in the frost-stiff grass. The second time she went down hard on one knee and sat in the cold for a moment, with her eyes closed, breathing through her teeth. Then she got up and kept pulling. Percy appeared in the doorway when she was 20 yards from the porch, his hair sticking up on one side from sleep, his eyes going very wide. "Mama, open the door and move the bench away from the wall," Mavis said, her voice controlled and even. "Do it now, please." Percy disappeared. By the time she got the man onto the porch and through the door, her son had cleared the space and was standing against the wall, watching with the wide, careful eyes of a child who understood that something serious was happening and had decided to be useful rather than frightened. Willa appeared from the back room, took one look at the blood-soaked man being lowered onto the floorboards, and did not scream. She went immediately to the kitchen and began building up the fire without being asked. Mavis knelt on the boards and began cutting away his coat with her sewing shears. The wounds were bad. One bullet had entered his right side below the ribs and exited clean. She found both the entry and exit and bound them with strips torn from an old flour sack. The second bullet, high in his left shoulder, had not exited. She could feel it, or thought she could, a small hard lump beneath the swollen flesh. She sterilized the thin blade of her boning knife in the fire, poured the last 3 inches of Daniel's medicinal whiskey over the wound, and then did what needed to be done. The man groaned and twisted, and she put her elbow across his chest to hold him still and kept working. She found the bullet and got it out, and dropped it in the basin with a sound like a small bell. Willa, without being asked, brought clean rags. Percy, without being asked, held the lamp steady and didn't look away even when Mavis knew he wanted to. Daniel would have been proud of both of them. The fever came on by midday, the way fevers always did, sudden and total, like a tide coming in. The man's skin burned so hot that Mavis could feel the heat rising off him before she touched him. He tossed and muttered, and once grabbed her wrist so hard she had a bruise there for 2 weeks afterward, though he didn't seem to know he'd done it. In his delirium he said words that didn't connect into sentences, and then sometimes sentences that were terrifyingly coherent. "Aldous," he said once, clearly, his head turning hard to one side. "Aldous will burn it. Get the ledger out." Mavis leaned closer. What ledger? But he was gone again, sliding back into the fever dark, his breath rattling. She sat with him through the afternoon and into the night, changing the cold cloths on his forehead, listening. He spoke of a ledger twice more. He spoke of a man named Aldous 3 times. He said the word deed twice, with a particular urgency that made Mavis look at the worn leather satchel he had been clutching when she found him, still strapped across his body, which she hadn't had the heart to remove entirely, some instinct telling her it mattered to him, even unconscious. After the children were asleep, she opened it. Inside was a U.S. Marshal's commission paper, identifying him as Marshal Cade Rennick, out of the Cheyenne district. There was a folded letter bearing the territorial seal. There were witness depositions, 6 of them, signed and dated over the past 3 months. And there was a ledger, a small, dense, meticulously kept record of payments made from the accounts of the Black Rock Mining Syndicate to various individuals, including the sheriff of Colton Ridge, a district judge in Laramie, and one Aldous Fenn, who was listed in the ledger as an operations manager, but who Mavis recognized, with a slow, cold flood of understanding, as the man who had handed her Daniel's canvas pouch of wages and told her the company bore no liability. The same man who had been to the claim twice since Daniel's death, inquiring with oiled politeness about whether she had given any more thought to the company's standing offer to purchase the acreage. The Colton claim sat directly above the secondary ore deposit that the BlackRock Syndicate had spent 2 years and considerable money trying to locate. The company geologist's report, which had been sealed and which she had never been meant to see, was also in the satchel, annotated in Marshal Rennick's handwriting. According to those annotations, the Colton acreage was worth conservatively $40,000 in extractable silver ore. Daniel hadn't died in an accident. Mavis sat at the table for a very long time without moving. She was still sitting there when a large hand closed around her wrist, gently, this time, and she startled so hard she knocked the lamp sideways. She caught it before it fell. When she turned, Marshal Rennick was lying on his back on the floor looking up at her with gray eyes that were fever-bright but focused. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was barely there, scraped raw. "Mavis Colton." She straightened the lamp. Her hands were not entirely steady. "This is my claim. I found you in the creek." He was quiet for a moment. His gaze moved to the satchel on the table, to the papers spread out before her. He didn't look alarmed, precisely. He looked like a man assembling information. "You read the ledger," he said. "I did, Colton." He said the name twice as if placing it. "Daniel Colton's widow." Something in her chest pulled tight. "Yes, I'm sorry," Rennick said. And then, which she had not expected, "It wasn't an accident. I expect you've figured that by now." The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind pushed at the eaves. Mavis folded her hands on the table and looked at them for a moment before she looked at him. "Go back to sleep, Marshal," she said quietly. "We'll talk about it when you're not still bleeding." A sound that might have been a short laugh, or might have been pain, moved through him. "Yes, ma'am." He was unconscious again in less than a minute. He healed in the particular way that big, stubbornly healthy men healed, badly at first, and then all at once, as if his body had simply decided that enough time had been wasted on being injured. By the 4th day he was sitting up. By the 6th he was in the chair, by the window, watching the high plains with the expression of a man who was accustomed to watching things and thinking about what he saw. By the 8th day, Percy had entirely lost his wariness of the large stranger and was sitting on the floor beside his chair asking him questions about outlaws and horses and whether he had ever been shot before. 3 times, Rennick said, without much drama. Percy's eyes went enormous. "Does it hurt bad?" Rennick considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. "The 3rd time you barely notice. That can't be true." "No," Rennick admitted. "It isn't." Willa laughed from across the room. It was the first time Mavis had heard her daughter laugh in 4 months. She turned back to the stove quickly, so neither of them would see her face. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, Mavis and Rennick sat on opposite sides of the hearth and talked. It was not the easy conversation of people who trusted one another, but the careful, practical conversation of people who needed to. He told her what he knew. The BlackRock Syndicate had been consolidating claims in the Laramie foothills for 3 years, acquiring them through a combination of legal purchase, manufactured debt, and, in at least 2 cases he could document, manufactured fatal accidents. The ledger detailed payments to the people who had made those accidents disappear. He had spent 6 months building the case. The depositions were from miners and surveyors who had seen things and were willing, under grant of federal protection, to testify to them. He had been 3 days from Cheyenne, from the federal prosecutor's office, when 2 men had come out of the dark on the BlackRock Service Road and put bullets in him, Aldous Fenn's men. "How did they know you were coming?" Mavis asked. Rennick's jaw tightened. "Sheriff Lund." She absorbed this. Sheriff Lund had a wide smile and a habit of tipping his hat to women and a star on his chest that she had, until this moment, considered a form of protection. "What do we do?" He looked at her across the fire. "I need to get the satchel to Cheyenne. That's the only thing that matters. The ledger, the depositions, the geologist's report. Once they're in the federal prosecutor's hands, there's nothing Fenn or Lund can do to make them disappear." He paused. "But I can't ride yet, and Fenn will know I'm not dead. He'll send men to find me, and when they do, they'll search every claim within crawling distance of that road." Mavis looked at the window. The high plains were dark and enormous out there. "Then we need to move the satchel," she said. Rennick looked at her steadily. "Where?" "Mrs. Pruett," Mavis said, "keeps the dry goods store in Colton Ridge. She's been keeping things that needed keeping since before either of us was born. She's also the only person in that settlement that Aldous Fenn has never managed to charm, bully, or frighten." She paused. "And she's my husband's aunt." Something shifted in Rennick's expression. Not quite a smile, but in the territory nearby. "How far is Colton Ridge?" 4 miles. I've done it on foot in under an hour." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'd be asking you to walk into Fenn's orbit to do this. You'd be asking me to walk into the settlement where I buy flour and where my children go to the schoolhouse," Mavis said calmly. "I've done it every week for 3 years. If I don't go, that's when it looks strange." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly. She went the next morning, the satchel in her flower basket, beneath a dish towel, Percy's hand in hers, and Willa walking on her other side as if it were any other Thursday. Mabel Pruett, small, ancient, sharp-eyed as a hawk, met her at the counter with the particular look of a woman who already knew something was wrong and was waiting to be told what. Mavis told her. Mabel listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of her. Then she took the satchel from beneath the dish towel, walked to the back room, and returned 4 minutes later without it. "It'll keep," was all she said, and handed Percy a piece of hard candy. Walking home, Mavis felt lighter, and then immediately felt afraid of feeling lighter, because fear had become such a constant companion that its occasional absence felt like a warning. They were 200 yards from the cabin when she saw the horses. 3 of them, tied at the porch rail. Men she didn't know standing in her yard, and one man she knew very well. Aldous Fenn, his hat in his hands, his expression arranged into the particular configuration of concern that she now understood had never once been genuine. "Mrs. Colton," he said, his voice carrying across the grass with practiced warmth, "we've been worried about you, out here all alone. There have been reports of a dangerous individual in the area, a fugitive, a man posing as a federal marshal." He shook his head. "I wanted to make sure you and your little ones were safe." Mavis stopped 10 feet from him. Percy's hand tightened in hers. She did not squeeze back. She needed him to feel that she was steady. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Fenn," she said. "We haven't seen anyone." Fenn's eyes moved to the cabin. "You won't mind if my men take a quick look around?" "I do mind, actually," Mavis said, keeping her voice entirely pleasant. "You'd need a warrant for that, I believe. Is Sheriff Lund with you? He could explain the relevant law." Fenn's expression flickered. It happened fast, a brief crossing of his face like a cloud shadow, and then the warmth was back. But she had seen it. "We're old friends, Mavis, neighbors. You don't need to be formal with me." "My children are with me, and we'd like to go inside," Mavis said. "I'm happy to speak with you again when you have the proper documentation." "Good day, Mr. Fenn." She walked past him to the door. Her back prickled with the consciousness of the 3 men behind her. She opened the door, moved the children through, and closed it and dropped the bar into its bracket without allowing herself to hurry. Inside, in the shadows of the back room, where he had no business being on his feet, Rennick stood with his Remington revolver drawn, pressed flat against the wall beside the window. He met her eyes and she shook her head slightly. He nodded and stayed put. Outside, after a long moment, she heard hooves. She went to the window in time to see Fenn's horse moving south at a trot, his men behind him. He did not look back. "He'll come back," Rennick said quietly, from the doorway of the back room. Yes, Mavis agreed. She was already moving to the kitchen. Willa, Percy, get your coats. He came back 2 days later, and he did not come with paperwork. The morning was overcast, a flat white sky sitting low over the plains, the kind of sky that muffled sound and made distance hard to judge. Mavis was splitting wood again. She had split a great deal of wood that week, because splitting wood was something she could do, and it kept her from going still. When Rennick appeared in the cabin doorway and said, without preamble, "Riders, 4 of them, coming from the north." This time there was no warning shot, no polite opening negotiation. Fenn had apparently concluded that politeness had run its course. The first bullet hit the corner post of the porch before Mavis had fully made it through the door. She did not stop to think about fear. Fear was a thing that happened after, when the body had time to remember what it had almost lost. Right now there were her children to account for. Willa and Percy were already moving before she spoke, Willa pulling Percy toward the root cellar door in the floor of the back room with a calm, determined competence that made Mavis's heart break open with pride. "Stay down and do not come up until I call you," Mavis told them. "Mama," Percy started. "I know," she said, and dropped the cellar door over them. She came back to the main room at a low run. Rennick was at the front window, his Remington out, his face set in the particular expressionless way of a man who was very afraid and very controlled simultaneously. He handed her, without looking away from the window, the small Colt pocket pistol from inside his coat. "You know how to use that?" "My husband made sure of it." She checked the load. 6 rounds. "What do we have?" 4 men, approaching spread out. "They want to pin us and burn us out." He glanced at her. "You take the east window. Anyone who gets to the corner of the barn, you stop them." It was that simple and that terrifying. Mavis went to the east window, knelt below the sill, and waited. The next 20 minutes unfolded in a series of terrible sounds and a few decisive actions. She did not let herself think about what she was doing beyond the immediate mechanical fact of doing it. One man came around the corner of the barn, and she put a shot 2 feet over his head, which she had decided was the appropriate target, and he scrambled back into cover. This appeared to revise his calculation about the situation, and he did not try the corner again. In the front she could hear Rennick firing, in the measured, unhurried cadence of a man who was used to fights lasting longer than they should, and she heard shouts from outside, and once a cry of pain that she decided not to examine too closely. A period of quiet followed, sudden and heavy. Then a voice from outside. Not Fenn's voice, someone younger, shakier. "We're leaving. Call it done." Rennick said nothing. Mavis heard hooves after a long moment, growing fainter, and then silence except for the wind. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall below the east window and breathed. Just breathed. The pocket pistol was still in her hand, and she set it down on the floorboards with great care, as if it were something fragile, which seemed funny to her in a way she couldn't have explained. Rennick appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, moving carefully around his stitches. He had blood on his sleeve again, but he didn't appear to have noticed it. He looked at her, and then he sat down on the floor on the other side of the doorway and leaned his head back against the frame. "You did well," he said. "I need you not to talk to me for approximately 1 minute, Mavis said. He nodded and was silent. After the minute, she stood up, opened the cellar door, and held her hand down for Percy. He came up first, and she pulled him hard against her and held him there. Willa came up second and stood close, her hand on Mavis's back, and Mavis recognized, with a particular grief, that her daughter had in the past 4 months become the kind of person who stood close and put her hand on your back when things were hard. She was 12 years old. That afternoon, Mavis left the children with Rennick and walked to Colton Ridge alone. She didn't go to Mabel Pruett's store. She went to the telegraph office. She sent a telegram to the federal prosecutor's office in Cheyenne. She included Marshal Rennick's commission number, which she had memorized from the paper in the satchel, and 3 sentences describing the contents of the ledger. She paid for the telegram with $2 from her tin, half of what she had left in the world, and walked home through the high, cold afternoon air, feeling as if she had just struck a match in a dark room. The federal men arrived from Cheyenne 4 days later, 2 deputy marshals and a prosecutor's clerk, riding hard and arriving at the Colton claim with a warrant that named Aldous Fenn, Sheriff Lund, and 7 others. Rennick was on his feet by then, still moving carefully, but on his feet and dressed and wearing his badge again, and the sight of it had a different quality now than it had when she'd first seen it face down in the mud. He met the deputies on the porch and spoke with them for a long time, and then they rode together toward Colton Ridge. Aldous Fenn was taken into custody at the land office, where he had been in the middle of filing papers to begin proceedings on the Colton claim foreclosure. The timing had a particular satisfaction to it. Mavis was told later, by Mabel Pruitt, who had heard it from the telegraph operator, who had heard it from the deputy who had been there, that when the warrant was read aloud and the charge of murder in the commission of fraud was included, Aldous Fenn had looked at the floor and said nothing. He had nothing to say because the ledger said everything that needed saying, and he had written it himself. Sheriff Lund had tried to ride out of Colton Ridge when he saw the federal horses coming and had made it approximately half a mile. The territorial governor's office sent a representative the following week, a young man with ink-stained fingers and an uncomfortable collar who sat at Mavis's table and explained, in the careful language of legal documents being condensed for a layperson, that the Colton claim was hers in full, that all fraudulent liens and debts manufactured by the syndicate were being voided, and that the BlackRock Mining Syndicate's assets were being seized pending federal investigation. He also placed a folded letter on the table. It was from the Rocky Mountain Central Railroad. The railroad, it turned out, did not want her ore. The railroad wanted water. The survey that Rennick's satchel had contained included a hydrology report that the company geologist had quietly buried, because Aldous Fenn had paid him to bury it, which showed that the Colton claim sat directly above an artesian source capable of supplying water for a proposed steam station. The railroad's expansion into the southern Wyoming territory required that station. Without it, the line stopped at Laramie. The letter offered a lease, a very generous lease. Mavis read it twice. Then she set it down and looked out the window at the high grass and the mountains, with their white peaks and the enormous pale sky, and she thought about Daniel believing in this land, when believing in it required stubbornness that some people called foolishness. He had not been foolish. She put the letter in the tin with the 2 remaining dollars. Rennick came to say goodbye on a Thursday morning in November, the sky that flat gray that meant snow by afternoon. He had a new coat. His old one was beyond saving, and his horse was a rested, well-fed animal that would have no trouble with the road to Cheyenne. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps with his hat in his hands, which Mavis observed was a thing he did when he was uncomfortable. "The prosecutor will want a deposition from you," he said. "Someone will ride out to take it." "You won't have to go to Cheyenne. That's fine," Mavis said. A silence fell. Percy and Willa were nominally doing chores nearby, but were not in fact doing chores. Willa was watching the middle distance with great concentration. Percy was watching Rennick with the open expression of a child who had run out of strategy. "Will you come back?" Percy asked. "Percy," Willa said, with the world-weary inflection of an older sister. "It's an honest question," Percy said, without apology. Rennick looked at the boy for a moment. Then he looked at Mavis. "That depends," he said, "on whether your mother would find a returned federal marshal more nuisance than he's worth." Percy turned to his mother with an expression of pure urgency. Willa appeared to be studying the horizon with the careful scientific attention of someone observing a natural phenomenon of great significance. Mavis looked at Cade Rennick, at the gray eyes and the new coat and the hat that he was turning in his hands, and she considered the remarkable fact that she had pulled this man out of the frozen mud of her creek and spent 3 weeks stitching him back together, and hiding his evidence, and shooting at people, out of an east-facing window, and that at no point in any of it had she felt alone. "I've found," Mavis said carefully, "that a man who actually makes himself useful is not a nuisance at all." Something in Rennick's face came loose, the particular tightness of a man who has been composed for a long time and has briefly allowed himself not to be. He looked down at his hat and then back up at her. "I'll finish in Cheyenne by December," he said. "The passes are still clear in early December." "The passes are still clear in early December," Mavis agreed. He put his hat on, nodded once to Willa, reached down and gripped Percy's shoulder firmly in the way that men did with boys they respected, and swung up onto his horse. He looked at Mavis once more from horseback. "Mrs. Colton," he said. "Marshal Rennick," she said. He turned the horse south toward the road. Percy watched him go, with his hand raised in a wave that Rennick returned without looking back, which meant he had known it was coming, and somehow that felt like the truest thing about him. That evening, Mavis sat down at the table and wrote a letter to Daniel's brother in Ohio, not asking for anything, just telling him about the claim and the railroad lease, and that the children were well and growing, and that the winter was coming, but they were going to be all right. She had not been sure of that when she was writing such letters for a very long time. She sealed it and set it by the door to go with the mail rider in the morning. Outside, the first snow of November had started, quiet and thorough, covering the grass and the mountains, and the road south in that particular silence that the high plains made when the world was between one thing and the next. And Mavis Colton, widow, head of household, woman of $4.32, who had turned out to be worth considerably more than that in every way that mattered, sat by the fire and listened to her children breathe in the next room, and let herself, cautiously and completely, believe in what came next.